For our vignette, we will be discussing and comparing the cases of displacement that each of us researched. Each of us will focus on one aspect of displacement, with the rest of us sharing our thoughts comparatively. Kara, we can begin with you.
Okay, we're going to start with a discussion on what made our groups of people migrate, and was that migration voluntary or forced? I focused on development-induced displacement in Sudan, which has become a very normalized practice as the search for more reliable energy sources has progressed to combat the energy crisis. This migration has definitely not been voluntary, but very forced, even to the point where international oil companies have been under mounting pressure to withdraw or fundamentally alter their operational policies. And this displacement focuses on two very important things happening in Sudan, and that is the oil crisis as well as the hydroelectricity crisis. And in the past few years, especially with military impact and war, northern government and allied southern militias have exacerbated these two situations and caused people to flee their homes into neighboring countries.
In my portion of the research, I touched on three different cases regarding the connection between xenophobia and forced displacement. With the contemporary issue I researched revolved around Syrian migrants, which obviously they were forcibly displaced during this Syrian civil war. In one case, they tried to go to Denmark, which led to a series of policies designed to sort of combat migration to Denmark, as they did not feel that they wanted to be a destination for migrants. In one case, they determined that they were going to revoke the residency permits of some certain migrants, essentially force them back to Syria, even though it's still a very volatile situation. In other situations, they're actually passing policy to relocate migrants, forcibly displace them to asylum centers outside of the country. They're reaching a deal with Rwanda currently, which I found very interesting. It seems very, very cruel and harsh, just a way to avoid migration. And in another case, I touched on Japanese residents during the Second World War, and obviously they were forcibly displaced into internment camps as a result of, fear and overblown feelings of a threat, and which was related to xenophobia and just racism. And regarding Chinese migrants in the 1800s, they were initially migrated voluntarily, with a series of laws designed to impede and eventually outright ban migration with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there were varying levels of how voluntary it was, but in general, it wasn't really. It was more forced than voluntary.
I did a comparative analysis of two waves of work displacement of Chinese women in the 20th century. While there were significant cases of human trafficking involved in these processes, I would argue that many Chinese women, in fact, migrated voluntarily under a shared, sometimes unrealistic yearning for the city, and also like a hope to permanently remove their rural identity. Nevertheless, it is important to maintain a nuance through acknowledging that although much of this displacement seemed voluntary, it was in fact involuntary under the fact that the general environment of the period was pushing women to be involved in productive labor, and women were criticized if they choose to remain at home.
For our next topic, we'll be just discussing some of the difficulties our groups faced during after the period of migration. The difficulties that the people that I studied are too numerous to count, really, so I'll just highlight what I viewed as the most prominent. In the case of the Chinese migrants, there were several instances of the hostility and xenophobia prominence throughout America, actually leading to the migrants being massacred, which is obviously terribly tragic, as was the case in the Los Angeles Massacre of 1871 and the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885. Regarding the Japanese internment camps, this forced migration essentially upended their lives in an incalculable way, and it forced them to sell their homes and start fresh after the war ended and they were finally free from the internment camps. Regarding the refugees of the Syrian civil war, it wasn't the case of a singular displacement, but rather a system that caused them to be on the move constantly, and that disrupted their ability to create a new life for themselves and sort of recover from that initial displacement.
I think for my group, the most difficult part for their displacement was the dire working conditions that they faced in their factories. More importantly, it was also the sense of helplessness and loneliness that these women workers were constantly suffering from due to the dialect barriers between themselves as well as the strict communication obstacles set by their factory owners or contractors?
So I'm going to focus this question towards, in regards to the affected groups of people in Sudan, is the conditions of the IDP camps people were forced to resettle in after the displacement occurred. The IDP camps have been victims of targeted attacks and looting, and as such face serious threats to their physical security and moral integrity. They also have difficulties in accessing basic services and markets, which has led to food insecurity and a dire situation in terms of their health. Furthermore, there is such a lack of data on the scale of urban displacement and only limited understanding and assessment of urban IDPs' needs. And as a result, IDPs not based in camps, and particularly those living in towns and cities, have become all but invisible.
Okay, in the end, let us look at some, maybe if you could have the positive aspects and effects that this process of displacement had brought for your group. In fact, for my group, although the general outcome for the Chinese women workers in the first wave was far from ideal, I saw much hope within the second waves of workers who utilized opportunities under general Chinese economic reform to achieve personal development and economic independence. In an ethnographic study I've come across, I learned the story of a woman factory worker named Trimming, who was able to break free from the tedious factory work and find a presentable job in the city with sufficient income. I believe that this process of having women to leave the family and to work and to supply herself strongly challenged a deep-rooted sexism within the Chinese traditional belief that women should be cloistered. And this had contributed to the further development and increasing awareness of women's rights among Chinese society.
Based on my research, I would honestly say that there are no truly positive effects that migration brought to the groups of people in Sudan. I say this because the groups of people that were forced to resettle in different areas tend to want to return to their prior owned land. This is because proposed resettlement sites are very barren, windswept places with no groundwater supply, which is quite different from the villagers' once current situation along the Nile River. One project, such as the Moreau Dam, that was supposed to solve the problem of flooding and help people in Sudan with irrigation problems and generate energy, the project did the complete opposite. The displaced populations due to this project were forced to live in IDP camps and no longer had the privilege of the Nile River at hand. A health impact study even showed for this dam project that 20 negative health impacts came about, and they expect the dam to introduce serious deadly diseases such as malaria.
Yeah, sort of echoing Kara's point, I feel as though there weren't really any benefits to migration for any of the groups I examined, especially once compared to the incalculable harm that they received. In particular with the Syrian migrants, I found that although they did find some solace in their new homes after leaving the refugee camps, ultimately all they wanted to do was return home, which obviously was impossible at that time and is continuing to be impossible. And they would have been better off had the initial displacement not had occurred. I hope you enjoyed listening to our podcast, and I hope you take something away and learn something from the maps that we spent so much time creating.